Toitu te mara tane, toitu te mara tangaroa, toitu te tangata. If the land is well and the sea is well, the people will thrive. Tēnei ka mihi ke te mana wheno o Aotearoa. We acknowledge the local tribal authorities of New Zealand and all other traditional custodians of the lands that you may be joining us from. Tēnā koutou katoa. Hello, everybody. A very warm welcome to you all. My name is Ben Adelberg, and I am based in Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland, New Zealand. I'm the co-founder of the Lentil Intervention, an Australasian advocacy platform disseminating all aspects of planetary health. Our aim is to inspire the adoption of lifestyle changes toward climate-friendly and healthy lifestyle practices and foster resilient communities. It is a New Zealand registered charity and forms the umbrella entity for the following three programs. Available on all popular podcasting platforms, the Lentil Intervention podcast hosts conversations with leading scientists, researchers, academics, health experts, PhD students, and other industry leaders, guests local to Australia and New Zealand, with the occasional exception, focusing on issues and bringing awareness to our most pressing and relevant challenges on our corner of the globe. The first of the community initiatives that fall under the Lentil Intervention is Sports Gear Revived. Established 12 years ago to run alongside my endurance sports coaching business, Kaitiaki Endurance Sports, Sports Gear Revived collects and redistributes unwanted sports clothing, shoes, and equipment to schools and groups within low socioeconomic and high deprivation communities of the Waikato and Northland regions of New Zealand. In doing so, we're enabling more to participate in sports, thereby enjoying the associated health and social benefits, immersing in nature, and creating better environmental awareness. And the other community initiative is Athletes for Nature, a movement of not just athletes, but outdoor enthusiasts that realize the importance of changing their behavior in a way that will positively impact nature. Katiakitanga is the Māori process and practice of conserving the environment, and as athletes, we are well primed to care about nature as this is our playground. There are 12 action steps that members can undertake. These have been created and will continue to evolve over time by our community. The goal for Athletes for Nature is to grow this community so we can inspire more outdoor enthusiasts, coaches, event organizers, and sponsors to incorporate more ethical and climate-friendly policies and behaviors. Membership to Athletes for Nature is irrespective of the sport code and the individual's affiliation to a particular club, group, or entity. No barriers, one community, irrespective of their background. And a big thank you to the sponsor of this webinar series, Pathfinder. Pathfinder is an ethical Kiwi saver that selects companies generating positive benefits and returns. To ensure that we provide no barriers to access to valuable sessions like these, they have supported this series. Emma and I have been co-hosting the Lentil Intervention podcast for 4.5 years now, and this is only the second time I'm actually introducing her. The first time being back in 2019 in Brisbane at a film screening I was hosting, and Emma was a panelist. Emma is an accredited practicing dietitian. She is a fellow of the Australasian Society of Lifestyle Medicine and holds a certificate in plant-based nutrition through Cornell University. After realizing the impact of our food system is so much bigger than simply influencing human health outcomes, Emma also completed a postgraduate certificate in climate change adaptation and a diploma of sustainable living. Initially working within the hospital system, Emma now runs a private practice, Green Stuff Nutrition, based in Queensland, Australia. She has also worked as a research assistant at a Queensland Medical Research Institute, so absolutely loves taking a deep dive into nutrition research. Of course, she is also the co-founder of Lentil Intervention and a 200-hour qualified yoga teacher. Emma Strutt.
Excellent. Thank you, Ben. And just before I get into it too deeply, I apologize for the bird noise in the background. There's a flock of gorillas right outside, and I apologize for my lisp. I have a very swollen tongue at the moment, so it sounds like I'm talking cotton wool in my mouth. Apologies for that. All right, so I really appreciate the opportunity to have a yarn to you today about this topic as part of this fantastic webinar series. Now, there's a lot to cover, so unfortunately, there's a bit that I won't be able to talk to today, but I hope this gives you at least a good overview of some of the concerns regarding our food system currently, the benefits of shifting to a more plant-rich eating pattern, and how to do that safely as an athlete. Before I properly get started, though, I'd just like to acknowledge the Darrinbal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which I talk to you today. Similarly, I'd like to extend that same acknowledgement to the traditional custodians of Aotearoa, where I'm sure most of you are tuning in from. Don't really need to go into this as Ben's already done a stellar introduction for me, but just to point out, I've been doing the whole meat-free thing now for half my life. I've been completely plant-based for a bit over 16 years, and I'm not dead from a protein deficiency yet, so it can be done. If you're here tonight, I'm sure you're already interested in stuff, but you probably already know the basics, if not more, in terms of climate change. But I just thought I'd quickly give you a bit of an overview of where we're at in 2024. We are smashing records left, right, and center, and it's not the kind that athletes are after. So these stats are taken from the World Meteorological Organization. It's the most recent data we've got for 2023. So if we take a look, it was the warmest year on record, being an average of 1.45 degrees above pre-industrial baseline, and it appears that that change is speeding up. So we can pretty well say that realistically, that 1.5 degree warming goal was dead in the water, and we need some really big shifts to keep it under 2 degrees. Ocean heat reached its highest level in the 65 years of being recorded, with over 90% of the world's oceans experiencing heat wave conditions at some point during the last year, which of course harms aquatic ecosystems and food systems as well. Antarctic sea ice extent reached an absolute record low, and similarly, our global set of reference glaciers experienced the largest loss of ice on record. And of course, this all has an impact on our sea levels. The global mean sea level reached a record high, with the rate of sea level rise in the past 10 years more than doubling since the first decade of satellite records. And finally, our three main greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitric oxide, all reached record high observed levels. And I can hear what you're thinking. You're like, yeah, cool. Thanks for the super happy stats, Emma. But what the hell does this have to do with the food we eat? Well, it has quite a bit to do with our food, actually. So to try and put food emissions into perspective here, this chart depicts CO2 equivalent emissions from various activities and diets. As you can see, the global average for food emissions per person per day is quite similar to that of a 40-kilometre car trip. So that's pretty significant already. But if we then take a look at the Australian average, and apologies, I couldn't find great data for New Zealand, but we do have very similar diets. You can see that it's a really big jump up to 14.5 kilograms of CO2 per person per day. Now, more than half of those emissions are actually coming from our red meat intake, and another 4 kilograms is from our discretionary food or our non-core food. So if we halve global emissions by 2030 to limit warming, as is recommended, and if we apply that equally across all industries, the global food emissions yardstick would be about 3 kilograms of CO2 per person per day. So that's a huge difference to where we currently are and where we need to be. And considering that some countries actually need to increase their food footprint to ensure nutritional adequacy, it's quite clear that Aussies and Kiwis are contributing far more than our fair share when it comes to diet-related emissions. So the general consensus is that our current food system is responsible for about a third of all human greenhouse gas emissions. It's the single largest greenhouse gas emitting sector in the world, but that also means that it's our greatest opportunity. So this paper, published in 2021, gives a really good breakdown of just where those emissions are coming from along that paddock to plate journey. The vast majority of emissions are from agricultural production and land use change. Interestingly, transportation only contributes 4.8%. So purely in terms of greenhouse gases, buying local is not actually as important as the types of food that you're buying. And the type of food that's most detrimental is your meat. Not all greenhouse gases are created equal either. Methane emissions account for a third of food system emissions. This is mainly from livestock. And the reason that methane is so important is that, yes, it is a short-lived gas when compared to CO2, but it has significant global warming potential. So 28 times more detrimental when measured over 100 years, but when measured over 2 decades, it's a massive 86 times more powerful. So cutting methane is the strongest lever we have to slow climate change over the next couple of decades, which are the crucial decades if we want to avoid blasting right past some of those irreversible tipping points. And as you can see, the agricultural and waste industries are the biggest emitters, more so even than the fossil fuel industry. And if we break that down even further, it's the cows, it's the sheep, and it's their manure that are the biggest problems. And just to note, more than a third of our current warming has been from methane, and methane has nearly tripled in the atmosphere in the past 250 years. So when it comes to food, plain and simple, animal-based products are more resource intensive. There's a marked difference between the greenhouse gas emissions of animal products when compared to most of your plant-based options. But if you walk away tonight and feel like you might only have capacity to concentrate on one thing to begin with, concentrate on beef. Beef has a huge environmental footprint when it comes to emissions, land use, and water use. And the more we can reduce our red meat products, the better it's going to be for our planet. When we talk about the environmental emergency, though, humans tend to have tunnel vision and we focus in on carbon, but there's so much more to it than that. And not only is our global food system a significant source of those greenhouse gases, it's by far the largest cause of terrestrial ecosystem destruction, accounting for 50% of global habitable land. It's responsible for 70% of our fresh water consumption, responsible for 78% of waterway pollution due to our overuse of nitrogen, phosphorus, and intensive livestock practices, and also for biodiversity loss. So we're currently living through the sixth mass extinction event, one that's largely man-made, and our food system plays a huge role in that. And the reason why our food system has such a high impact is because it's riddled with inefficiencies. So as I've just mentioned in the previous slide, humans use half of our global habitable land for agricultural production, but 77% of that is for rearing livestock. Only 23% goes to food crops for humans. So despite being so dominant in land allocation, meat and dairy products supply only 18% of our global calorie supply, only 37% of our global protein supply. So that 11 million square kilometres used for crops supplies more calories and more protein for our global population than almost 4 times larger area that's dedicated to raising livestock. So it's an incredibly inefficient use of space. This is not sustainable. It's not just on land either. Our oceans are suffering too. So overfishing remains a significant problem, with many of our fishing methods being quite environmentally destructive. Aquaculture is quite problematic as well. It's pollutive. It's a risk to wild marine populations in the areas where the farms are. And it's also still inefficient. So for 1 kilogram of farm salmon you get out, you need to put in 1.6 kilograms of wild fish to actually rear that salmon. And if you care about plastics in the ocean, you should care about the fishing industry. So these stats are from a 2018 paper, so it'll be even worse now. But it was predicted that at least 79,000 tonnes of plastic are floating within that Great Pacific Garbage Patch. 46% of that is fishing nets. So honestly, there's so much we could continue talking about. I haven't even touched on things like deforestation or antibiotic use or zoonotic disease risk, but we need to get into the nuts and bolts of plant-based eating very soon. So to start wrapping this particular section up, it's very clear that we're living well outside our means when it comes to our food choices. If diets of G20 countries like Australia were adopted globally, up to 7.4 planets would be needed to sustain us. We do not have the space or the natural resources to continue eating this way. And we have some really huge challenges ahead. So with our growing population, we're actually going to need about 56% more food by 2050. And we need to do that without using any more land for agriculture, ideally less, so we can start rewilding. We also need to achieve this food increase while lowering emissions and addressing huge concerns around obesity and undernutrition. So we've got some pretty massive challenges ahead, but there are solutions. So modelling has suggested that it is biophysically possible to feed 10 billion people a healthy diet within planetary boundaries, and transitioning to a plant-based diet is the most important single tool in our toolkit. I mean, that alone is not enough. We need to also ensure that the calories we're eating are healthy ones. We need to halve our food waste, and we need to increase agricultural efficiency. but that shift to a plant-rich eating pattern is the most important strategy. So can we do that as athletes? Yes. A plant-based diet is safe. Meat is not a necessity. You can achieve adequate nutrition eating this way, and it's backed up by some of the world's largest dietetics associations. So this excerpt is taken word for word from the American Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics position paper on plant-based diets. Unfortunately, they're overdue for an update. So this one is now officially out of date, but it's still the latest that we can draw on. It outlines that plant-based diets are healthy, safe, and appropriate for all life stages, including athletes. They also go on to list a reduced risk of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity, certain cancers, and they outline why this is the case. The British Dietetic Association has a similar position, as do Dietitians Australia. Dietary guidelines around the world, by and large, also support the inclusion of plant-based diets as a healthy and safe option. The Aussie guidelines are well overdue for an update, and that's currently in the works. But going off what we've got now, they state that appropriately planned vegetarian diets, including vegan diets, are healthy, nutritionally adequate, and their plate model includes plant-based choices in each food group. New Zealand has eating guidelines describing an eating pattern that is largely plant-based as well. And for athletes specifically, this way of eating is a really great option. We just need to look at our lovely model Ben here as an example. But here's why. So for athletes, especially endurance athletes, carbs are still king. It's the substrate most efficiently metabolized by the body. It's the only macronutrient that can be broken down rapidly enough to provide energy during those periods of high intensity exercise. And a lot of athletes actually fail to consume enough to fully replenish muscle glycogen stores. And obviously, this can lead to performance impairments. The good news is that plant-based eaters tend to consume more carbs, up to 15% more in some instances. So this plant-centered diet approach is actually an excellent strategy for athletes, especially endurance athletes. We also have studies showing that short-term low-carb diets increase bone breakdown after exercise, even if the athlete has adequate caloric intake. So we obviously need more long-term studies on this, but that's suggestive of potential risk to bone health if your diet is low in carbs. Similarly, inadequate carbohydrate intake has been shown to affect hormones in female athletes. So luteinizing hormone, T3, leptin, these are all hormones associated with REDS. So athletes need to carb up for more reasons than just restoring those glycogen stores. Obviously, different athletes will have very different carbohydrate needs. This table gives a pretty basic overview of the requirements of the different types of activities. But please, in this protein-obsessed world, do not forget the importance of carbohydrates for performance. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to have to skim over the next few benefits pretty quickly, but they are important to mention. Firstly, heart health. This one is really, really important. I made international news when, what's his name? Bob Harper from The Biggest Loser, that trainer from America, he had a heart attack in the gym. So you can do all of the activity in the world, but you cannot outrun a bad diet. Cardiovascular disease, it remains our biggest killer. So whether you're an athlete or not, you need to be looking after your heart. Also, endurance athletes especially need to pay close attention to this. So this is an Australian study. It was published in December last year. It actually looked at elite endurance athletes, and it found that 1 in 6 of those participants had heart measures that fell in a range that would normally be associated with heart disease. Now, that wasn't all plaque buildup. Some of those findings were associated with the phenomenon athlete's heart. But there are other studies like this one published in July last year that found that long-term endurance sports participants actually had more coronary plaque than fit and healthy individuals doing more moderate exercise. And this is just one example of a handful of previous studies that have found similar outcomes. And plant-based diets have again and again and again been associated with improved cardiovascular outcomes, including lower blood pressure, lower cholesterol levels, lower blood viscosity, which is also good for performance because you get increased tissue oxidation, and improved arterial health. Now, one of the components tied up with that is actually the next on our list, which is nitrates. So healthy plant-based eating patterns deliver really good amounts of dietary nitrates, which is great for health, yes, but it's also linked with improved endurance exercise performance. So most of the studies in athletes have been done specifically with dietary nitrate supplements, so things like concentrated beet juice. But it has been shown to increase power output, increase time to exhaustion, and increase the distance traveled by an athlete. So a plant-based diet rich in those nitrate-containing veggies and leafy greens is going to be a really helpful strategy. Healthy plant-based eating patterns are also high in antioxidants. They help reduce oxidative stress and have been shown to reduce markers of inflammation like CRP. Now, this is really important because exercising, while very, very good for you, produces free radicals, which results in oxidative stress. And exercise-related oxidative stress can lead to muscle fatigue, reduced athletic performance, and impaired recovery. But compared to omnivores, plant-based eaters tend to have increased antioxidant capacity due to their, higher intake of things like vitamin C, vitamin E, beta carotene. And they also tend to have high intakes of particular food that can decrease post-exercise inflammation and reduce recovery time. So things like watermelon and blackberries. And as I'm sure you're all aware, recovery is vital for effective athletics. And finally, this is also emerging evidence, but it's suggested that a diet that supports gut health, i.e. diets rich in plants, can also support athletic performance via a number of mechanisms. So the more you can power up with plants, the better it's going to be. Now, I've been talking a lot about endurance athletes, but there is that persistent stereotype of the skinny, weak vegan. So can you build muscle on a plant-based diet? Yes, you definitely can. So whether you're an endurance athlete wanting to put on some lean mass, if you're an Olympic athlete, if you're a certified gym junkie, you can build muscle and perform really well on a plant-based diet. Now, I've chosen these people as an example because they're all long-term vegans. Some of them have even been vegetarian since birth. And I've done that to disprove that common rebuttal of oh yeah, you might be vegan now, but you built your muscles as a meat eater. So these people are proof that it can be done. But don't just take their word for it or mine. The science backs this up. So this paper was from 2020. It looked at whether a vegan diet was detrimental to endurance and muscle strength. The results suggested that a vegan diet does not seem to be detrimental. And in fact, the study actually showed that submaximal endurance might have been even a little bit better in the vegans. This is a 2022 study. It looked at skeletal muscle and vascular properties between vegans and omnivores. It found no difference. This is a 2021 paper. It assessed high protein plant-based diets versus protein-matched omnivorous diets in regards to resistance training adaptations. They found no difference between the two groups, suggesting that protein source doesn't affect training adaptations and the ability to build muscle. It's about whether you're getting enough. There are countless other studies now published in the literature, but you get the picture. It can be done. It's not so much the source of the protein that matters. You just need to make sure you're getting it. So let's talk shop on protein and make sure that you are indeed getting enough. Firstly, all plants have protein. Of course, your legumes and your soy products have the edge in terms of amount per serve, but options like your grains, your potatoes, even your non-starchy veggies, leafy greens will provide you with some protein. So for reference, one egg contains about 5.5 grams of protein. 100 grams of uncooked steak or chicken breast usually gives you about 20 to 22 grams. So it's quite comparable to some of the options here on the slide. Now, for most athletes, you will need a little bit more protein than a sedentary person, but you also need more overall calories. So ensuring that you eat adequate calories and get a good variety of food from all of your different food groups, you'll more often than not also ensure sufficient protein intake as well. But it does pay to just be a little protein aware. With protein for athletes, though, it's not just about the overall quantity, it's also really important to consider timing of intake across the day. But if we just first have a quick look at overall recommendations, most athletes will be perfectly fine with an intake somewhere between 1.2 to 2 grams per kilogram per day. For endurance athletes, it's generally towards the lower end of that recommendation, whereas for power athletes or people wanting to put on a bit of mass, you might do better with a little more. Now, there's some emerging evidence regarding high intakes for athletes needing to go into a hypocaloric state for weight loss while also looking to retain or build muscle, which is actually really, really hard to do. But this is still an evolving area of research. But what we do know is that there is no additional advantages to very high intakes of protein. So more is not necessarily better. What's more important to pay attention to is actually your protein distribution across the day. It's a really common trap to fall into, dumping most of your protein into 1 or 2 meals only. But this is not an optimal way to reach your recommended intake. So ideally, to maximize that muscle protein synthesis, you want to be having between 20 to 40 grams of protein per serve at main meals, and then also sneaking some protein into snacks. And then after exercise, when you're looking to have some protein to help with that muscle synthesis, make sure that you're pairing it with carbohydrates as well, because that's going to enhance the effects as well as help with the glycogen replenishment. Now, if this all sounds too complicated, it's really, really not. I'm going to use myself as an example here, along with some wishful thinking, and just pretend I'm an endurance athlete for the day. So my protein requirements in total would be about 75 grams per day. And if I was to spread that evenly to make sure that I'm still getting enough to maximize my muscle protein synthesis, I want to be getting about 20 grams of protein in my main meals, about 10 grams of protein in my snacks, which is very, very achievable. Like, I'm really not joking here. So this is a sample meal plan quantifying the protein from foods. You'll see it's absolutely nothing special. It's not even optimized for an athlete. It's just general eating to making sure that you're still getting in, some foods from each of your food groups. We're already at 83 grams of protein. Some people, mostly gym junkies, will want to wade into the weeds and start to worry about things like leucine. I'm not going to talk about this in great detail. I don't have time to, but honestly, I'd recommend that most people don't need to stress about this too much anyway. But for the athletes that are concerned, you don't need to turn to a whey protein isolate supplement after training. Now, to get to that 3 gram threshold, if that's what you're aiming for, you probably would need a supplement, but you can achieve this with plant-based options. But it's important to note you can get good amounts of leucine through food too. So I've listed out some reasonable options here. So if you include these types of foods in your meals after exercising, that's going to be a benefit. I will almost always recommend real food over isolated supplements, because that way you'll be getting an array of other nutrients as well, which is going to benefit health. But I do acknowledge that some people may still choose to supplement as an athlete. And if you do, again, you can get by just fine by choosing the plant-based options. So I've listed out some of the common supplements here. For the sake of time, I'm not going to run through them. But again, I want to promote that food first approach wherever possible. But if you do choose to supplement, you're not going to have any impaired outcomes if you choose the plant-based versions. Okay, so moving on. On a plant-based diet, there are a few micronutrients to be mindful of. For the sake of time, I'm only going to cover 2 today that I think are going to be most important for your plant-based athletes. Firstly, vitamin B12. So this is important for nerve and cellular function, for proper oxygen carrying capacity. It plays a role in the metabolism of fats and carbs as well. So it's really crucial for good health and performance. It's really important to pay attention to your B12 intake, because if you let a deficiency go on for too long, the health problems can actually become irreversible. So please take this seriously, and it's so simple to meet your requirements. Vitamin B12 is a little unique in that it's actually produced by bacteria. So there have been some papers suggesting that certain plant foods may contain really small amounts of B12, but they're generally quite low or in varying amounts. So you can't consider these a reliable source. And some of the forms of B12 in these types of foods are actually inactive in humans. So if you're a strict plant-based eater without any animal products, you need to take a supplement or have multiple and frequent intake of fortified foods. You can't just rely on fermented foods. You can't rely on dirt that's still on your veggies. I don't care if they were grown organically. Please take a supplement. Even if you're not a strict vegan, so if you're a vegetarian, for example, or if you're trying to consume meat only occasionally, you still might need to consider supplementing here. So vitamin B12 in eggs is generally poorly absorbed, and the B12 content in milk is usually pretty low, and losses also occur during processing. So it's not uncommon for a lacto-ovo-vegetarian to actually be B12 deficient. And you really don't need that much. You can either take a supplement every day or every few days, depending on what kind of dose you want to take. But you do need to take it if you're going plant-based. This is the only non-negotiable supplement. And it's just so frustratingly common for people to believe the BS that's out there about plant-based eaters not needing it. So please, please take it. Another common myth is that you'll become anemic if you don't eat meat as an athlete. But just like it is with protein, it's not about eating meat. It's just making sure that you're consuming enough iron, and you can source iron from plants. So if we compare some animal-based foods and plant-based foods, all foods here are listed out in the recommended serving sizes according to the Australian Dietary Guidelines. And as you can see, the plant-based options actually have more iron. But there is a caveat to that in terms of absorption, and we'll discuss that in just a tick. But athletes in particular, they have good reason to be concerned about iron status because deficiency obviously is going to impair performance, and you do probably need a little bit more than the general population. So iron deficiency can be a problem for anyone, regardless of whether you eat meat or not. It's one of the world's most common nutrient deficiencies. But it does appear athletes, particularly endurance athletes, have slightly higher rates of deficiency than the general population. Female athletes especially need to be iron aware. So up to 35% of female endurance sports athletes can report iron deficiency at some stage. There's a number of contributing factors for iron deficiency amongst athletes. So you lose a little through your sweat, through your GI tract, especially as an endurance athlete. So up to 85% of athletes engaging in really intense endurance events can actually experience blood loss through your GI tract. There's also things like foot strike hemolysis, intravascular hemolysis. In fact, athletes tend to have a red blood cell life expectancy of 80 days, whereas the general population have an expectancy of 120 days. So there's a bit of a difference there. And athletes also have an upregulation of hepcidin after exercise, which actually can inhibit iron absorption. And then there's the more typical reasons, things like inadequate intake, not paying attention to dietary absorption enhancers and inhibitors, as well as menstruation in females. Now, plant-based diets in Western countries generally tend to contain as much, if not more, iron than meat-containing diets, but the absorption rates can vary a lot. So typically, you only absorb between 2 to 20% of the iron in plant foods, while a 15 to 35% absorption rate is expected from your animal foods. There's a few factors that can inhibit iron absorption. The main two I want to mention tonight, though, are your phytates or your phytic acid. This is found in a lot of your iron-rich plant foods, particularly your grains and your legumes. But the good news is that phytates reduce when they're cooked or soaked. And I don't know anyone that walks around, eating raw rice and lentils. So it becomes a reasonably small concern on a well-planned diet. But if you are really trying to boost your levels or deficiency is an ongoing concern for you, you could look at things like sprouting or fermented preparation methods like sourdough bread, for example, and this is going to decrease those phytates even more. Now, the tannins and the polyphenols in tea and coffee are really big ones. It's one of the most common causes I've seen in practice regarding plant-based eaters becoming iron deficient. Tea and coffee can greatly reduce iron absorption. So tea is the worst offender here. It can actually reduce absorption by as much as 70%. So move your tea and coffee away from your meals, about an hour either side. And just to note, it's not the actual caffeine, it's the polyphenols. So switching to a decaf option really is not going to make much of a difference. Absorption enhancers are really important considerations for plant-based eaters too. So they include vitamin C rich foods, so things like your citrus, your strawberries, kiwi fruit, broccoli, red capsicum. Vitamin C actually increases absorption so much, it almost removes the difference between the heme and the non-heme absorption rates. Other absorption enhancers include beta-carotene rich foods, so things like your carrots, your sweet potatoes, and foods from your allium family, so garlic, onion. The best thing to do, though, is just get into the habit of pairing your iron-rich foods with your vitamin C-rich foods at all of your main meals. And you'll find that this actually happens by default in a lot of your more traditional cuisines. But given that plant-based eaters and athletes do have slightly higher requirements than the general population, please pay attention to your iron intake. And if you are plant-based, if you're female, if you're an endurance athlete, it would pay to watch your iron levels pretty closely, as you may need to consider additional steps like supplementation or fortified foods at certain times, or utilize products like a Lucky Iron Fish or cast iron cookware. It's recommended that athletes following plant-based diets or endurance athletes or those athletes that have a recent history of iron deficiency, you should get quarterly screening to actually assess your iron levels. Okay, so we've talked about the specifics, but then how do we actually do it? How do we tie it all together and eat a balanced plant-based diet? It's really not about reinventing the wheel here. The simplest way is to swap like for like. So if you're used to having meat and veggies and starch on your plate, You can't just take the meat off the plate and call it a day. You'll have taken a big chunk of your calories away. You've taken a lot of your protein, your iron, your zinc away. So in the long run, if you're eating like this, you're going to end up feeling pretty rubbish. But you can't just fill that space with extra veggies. Look, I'm all for a higher veggie intake, of course, but this is not a balanced plate, especially for an athlete. Likewise, you can't just fill the plate with more starch. We need a good variety of foods from all of your food groups, and that's where your more protein-rich foods come into play. So that's things like your soy products and your legumes. Ideally, they should be taking up about a quarter of your plate, maybe a little bit more, depending on what type of athlete you are. One of the biggest pitfalls for an athlete when initially making that swap to plant-based eating, though, is under-fueling. So gram for gram, plant-based foods are typically lower in calories than your animal products. So the overall volume of your food may need to be increased. So if you struggle to eat larger meals, it might pay to include more of your calorie-dense foods in your meals and your snacks. So things like your nuts, your seeds, your nut butters, dried fruit, avocado, slightly processed grain options like whole grain breads, crackers, wraps, and cereals. They're usually more calorie dense than your intact whole grains like brown rice. So they're often a really good option to include as well. And again, your soy and legume products should be included at each meal. So a really easy way to plan your meals is with a plate model. And at the risk of sounding like a broken record, eat a good variety of foods from all of your plant-based food groups, your fruits, your veggies, your grains, your legumes, and small amounts of nuts and seeds. For the general population and for weekend warriors, aiming for about half of your plate to be your non-starchy veggies, about a quarter of your plate to be more protein-rich foods, and then a quarter of your plate to be grains and starches. For most people in this category of activity level, that's as technical as you need to get. You might need to tweak things around the edges like your iron, your vitamin D, or your protein intake, but generally that's it. It's not very hard. But for people that are more active, and of course, it depends on the type of activity you're doing, the duration, the intensity, and your personal goals, but you might need to mix it up a bit. So this is called the athlete's plate model. It's a great little visual to help people plan their meals without getting overwhelmed by all of the facts and the figures that we've just run through. So as you can see, there's plant-based options in each food group category. The biggest change up is actually matching your carb intake to your training load. A lot of people think this way of eating is a bit complicated and they don't really know what to do to start with. And look, I can acknowledge that it can seem a bit overwhelming at first, but I assure you, cooking plant-based foods can be simple and healthy, and you might not actually need to change all that much. So a great place to start is just thinking about the meals you already love, finding out how to make them plant-based. So if we just run through an example now and apply some of the principles we've just talked about. Spaghetti bolognese. It's often a favorite dish for athletes because you can carb up and it's got a good amount of protein. So if we run through what we need to tweak to make it a healthy plant-based option, first we start with meat. Obviously that's got to go, but it's a pretty easy swap. You can sub in some brown lentils and you'll have comparable protein, iron, and zinc. Or if you're really after that mincy texture and you want a bit more protein, you could utilize something called TVP, which is textured vegetarian protein that's made from soy. That is a bit more of a processed option though, so it is about personal preference in terms of how closely you want to adhere to a whole foods diet. Next is the sauce. If you're making your own, fantastic. But if you're buying a bottled sauce, I mean, check the ingredients list, obviously, but more often than not, you can use the exact same thing. To make it more nutritionally sound, though, you don't just want to stick with that classic meat and sauce combo or meat and lentil combo, lentil and sauce combo as it is in this instance. You want to sneak in some extra veggies. So the more color, the better, but you want to at least make sure you're getting in some leafy greens and some vitamin C rich options to enhance that iron absorption. And then to the pasta, if you're buying or if you're making fresh, be careful about your use of egg. But if you're buying pasta off the shelf, again, check, but generally you can use the exact same thing. But if you want to bump up the nutrition, and I recommend you do, swap to a whole grain pasta option rather than your white, or consider a pulse pasta for some added protein and fiber. So as you can see, really not hard swaps, a few tweaks and you're done. If you're flying solo on your plant-based journey and you need to cater for other dietary preferences at home, there's a few strategies that can make it a little easier to ensure you're not making a million different dishes at once. So the first option is just to sub the animal protein for something else. So, for a roast or for your classic veg and meat combo meals, take off the meat and add in some, marinated tofu or tempeh. For burgers, you could swap a meat patty for a falafel or a legume patty. For breakfast cook-ups, scrambled egg could become scrambled tofu, so on. So this is a really easy one-for-one swap. Another option is to cook a plant-based meal for everyone in the house, serve your own up, and then add some meat or cheese or whatever it may be for everyone else. Statistically, we are all needing to eat more plants anyway, so you'll actually be doing everyone a favor in your household if you opt for this strategy. Next is to use two different pans, but not two different meals. So you can use the same base for things like curries, casseroles, pasta sauces. But in your personal plan, you add the legumes, whereas meat goes into the other dish. It's usually pretty similar in terms of cook time, unless you're cooking, your beans from dried. And, at the end of the day, you'll only have one extra pan in the washing up. Another option is to let people construct their own meals at the dinner table or before it goes into the oven. This works really well for things that have various components, so things like pizza or Mexican or wraps. Everyone's probably going to have similar foundations in terms of the veggies, but then people get to choose their own protein and extras, so everyone comes away happy. And then finally, a meat-free meal isn't going to kill a meat eater. So statistically, our fruit and veg intake is atrocious anyway. So strategies like meat-free Mondays can be really great regular inclusions in your household. Okay, last but not least, let's talk gut health. A healthy plant-rich diet is a high fiber diet. So this can be a legitimate concern for people if you've never eaten these types of foods before. It does take a little bit of time to get used to as your microbiome adjusts to new food sources. GI problems can be really common concerns for athletes too. For the endurance athletes on the line tonight, I'm sure you're all familiar with runner's diarrhea. So let's kind of talk some general strategies to get you started on these new foods as an athlete. So to cultivate predictable bowels, you need to cultivate predictable eating patterns. So you don't need to be eating the exact same thing day in, day out. And of course, you need to match your intake of calories and carbs to your training load. But it's not the wisest idea to have hugely different volumes of food intake each day or massively different FODMAP loads from day to day either. So again, go back to that plate model, use those portion guidelines to help you create most of your meals, and they're already going to be reasonably standardized. Next is maintain a continuous optimal hydration status. So dehydration, overhydration, improper choice of hydration beverages can all contribute to noticeable GI distress. Just because you're transitioning to a plant-based diet doesn't mean you need to forget everything else you know about sports nutrition. So your needs here won't change markedly if you're an athlete at the level where you need to kind of major in the minors though. There are a couple of things to mention. So your plant foods generally have higher water content than your animal products. And if you're transitioning to a whole food plant-based diet, your sodium intake is likely going to be a fair bit lower than what you're used to. So just pay attention to those things in terms of hydration. Very importantly, you want to practice that pre-event meal and your race day nutrition strategies in training. Do not ever introduce completely new foods or strategies on race day. So it's a really good idea to take the time to develop and trial a list of high carb, low fat, lower fiber plant foods and make sure they become tried and proven before an event. Generally speaking, you want to save those higher fiber plant-based options like your legume heavy dishes and huge amounts of intact whole grains until after practice, where you've got the time to rest and digest properly. And be really mindful of supplements too. So sometimes when athletes make the switch to plant-based, they want to load up on various herbal and dietary supplements. Even some of your protein powders can be a bit iffy for some people's guts. Most of these supplements are not going to be necessary, but if they are, introduce just one at a time, track your symptoms. It may be more advantageous to take them in smaller amounts, but in more frequent doses. And then specifically in terms of fiber load, legumes especially, they're super high in fermentable and prebiotic fibers, which is actually a really good thing for your gut, but some people can be a bit sensitive to them. A lot of people take to legumes like a duck to water and have no issues. You might notice, however, for a couple of weeks, there'll be a bit of a transition phase, but that will settle. For some people, though, it might take a little bit more work than that. And if that's you, you can try some tips. Most important one here is probably start low and go slow. So just like you wouldn't walk into the gym and try and deadlift 150 kg without any prior training, might not be the best idea to have 1.5 cups of chickpeas straight off the bat. So if you've noticed a bit of tummy trouble with a legume heavy dish, cut back, start with a smaller amount. You might even need to start as small as 1 to 2 tablespoons and build your amount up over the course of weeks or months. Train your gut to get used to them, just like you train your muscles. That's going to be the most important tip. Um, I won't run through all of them for the sake of time. I will mention, though, athletes tend to be very hungry people, so you can eat quickly because of this. Digestion starts in the mouth, so use your teeth, eat mindfully, try and eat without distraction. So don't eat in front of the TV or on your phone. Chew really thoroughly, because the more you digest up here, the less work your gut has to do later on. Certain herbs and spices actually contain digestive aid properties. So, hook into the herbs and spices. They're going to be quite beneficial for this, as well as the antioxidants. And then finally, if you've trialed everything, but you're still struggling, you might actually have a FODMAP sensitivity. And if that's the case, it's best to get input from a knowledgeable dietitian that can actually help you navigate that while still ensuring nutritional adequacy. So let's recap. Typical Western diets are environmentally harmful. They are a lot more resource intensive than a plant-based eating pattern. Plant-based diets are safe, and athletes can achieve nutritional adequacy while eating this way without impaired performance. It just takes a little bit of planning. You can't just take the meat off the plate, though, and call it a day. You need to sub something in. So include those legumes and soy products. Plant-based eating patterns are generally less calorically dense, so make sure you're eating enough. This is the biggest pitfall I see in athletes initially changing their diet. They tend to underfuel, and then they worry that it's the plant-based diet, not the actual calorie deficit, that's impacting their performance. Make sure you spread your protein intake evenly across the day. Don't just dump it all into dinner. Take a B12 supplement. It's necessary, and it's unsafe if you don't. And do pay attention to your iron. Include those iron-rich foods. Be particularly mindful of inhibitors and enhancers of iron absorption. And then if you've got a sensitive gut, ease into this higher fiber way of eating slowly. It might pay to just rely a little bit more heavily on your soy products as your gut gets used to the fermentable fibers and all of your other legumes. And lastly, today's talk only scratched the surface of what we could have talked about. As an athlete, please think of nutrition as part of your training. It is vitally important. So I urge you to continue learning about this way of eating if you're wanting to make this switch. There are some fantastic free resources online. YouTube-wise, I think Nutrition Made Simple is a really, really fantastic channel. It's run by an MD and PhD, someone who's got an excellent grasp on nutrition science, and he's really fair with how he presents things. There's no vegan bias. So if you like videos, that's definitely one to check out. Veganhealth.org is probably my favorite website for vegan nutrition information. It's run by a stellar team of dietitians, so it's very reliable information. And then, of course, there's a plethora of books to help plant-based athletes out. Some are written by dietitians, some are written by athletes. I think probably the best of the bunch is the Plant-Based Sports Nutrition. It's a really fantastic book if you're a details and data orientated person, or if you want to know the ins and outs of everything. That's the book for you. So that's it. I'll hand it back over to Ben. I've probably gone on for a little bit too long, but I hope we've got time for a couple of questions if anyone wants to query me more on anything that we've covered.
And if you enjoy podcasts, I certainly highly recommend going into the archives of the Lento Intervention, as we have interviewed a fair few both health professionals that have either overcome health ailments or direct experience working with general public, and some athletes as well, some plant-powered athletes as well. So there's a lot of inspiration as well as science in the podcast. Emma, thank you. I always know who to turn to when it comes to nutrition-related knowledge. As I said at the start, you don't just sort of follow what you learned a few years back at uni. You're up with the play, current science, and that's important. Athletes for Nature is all about taking action. And one of the single most important action steps we can take is looking at your diet. And as Emma has clearly demonstrated in the first many slides, it's crucial that a small change, no matter what it is, whether you go fully plant-based or at least one day a week,
that's already making a change. So Emma, thank you as always. Really appreciate your insight, but also the some of the pitfalls to look out for. We need to eat. We need to make sure we eat enough, and we need to look out for certain. I wouldn't say deficiencies, but at least things, certain micronutrients that we just need to be aware of. So, thank you to our attendees. Any questions? This is your chance. I know that the majority on here are pretty much there with their plant-based way of eating, but still, sometimes we're just vegan, but not whole food. So there's always still improvements we can make in some areas. Any questions? Any questions for Emma?
Okay, it's Adriana. I'll ask the question. With iron deficiency,
Yeah.
so actually iron absorption, are we talking about any tea? Because like for example, I like to drink chamomile tea and peppermint tea.
Mhm.
Is it bad for iron absorption, or are we talking about English tea?
Your black tea, your English tea is going to be the worst. But because it's actually to do with the polyphenol content, some of your herbal teas will still impair iron absorption. Nowhere near as bad as your black tea, though. So if you're having chamomile tea, you can expect some impairment, but it's not going to be significant. But if you're a black tea drinker, that's when you really do have to worry about that. So Adrian, if you've got a history of iron deficiency, you'd probably want to be mindful even of the herbals and move them away from your meals a little bit greater than 30 minutes to an hour. But if you're going along okay with your iron, I feel like you could continue drinking your chamomile tea closer to your meals if you wanted to.
So what would be kind of normal iron level for female runner?
For a female runner, you'd want at least ferritin is the main one that
Mm-hmm.
will be assessed in a blood test, and you'd want that to be above 30 if you can.
Yeah, yeah.
So for a female, it depends on the lab that's doing the test, but generally the assay recommended levels for a female will be 25 and above. But for an athlete, you want that to be a little bit higher. So if you get it above 30, that's a good thing to aim for.
Oh, that's good then. Cool. Thanks.
No worries.
Emma, just to add to that, because I know I have been asked this before, you talk about the iron or sort of inhibitors to absorption of iron through the polyphenols, red wine included, and so on. And then what it enhances, apple cider vinegar, vitamin C, carotene, and so on. What if you have the combination of both? So say you're having your cup of tea, but you've got a hell of a lot of vitamin C.
Yep.
How does that sort of
That
balance
that's
each
going to
other out?
help a lot. That's going to help a lot. So vitamin C is so powerful in terms of enhancing your absorption that it can actually go a long way to remove the negative impacts from those inhibitors. With your tea and your coffee, though, just because they can so greatly reduce that absorption, I still think it's a really good idea to get into that habit of moving it away from meals. But, I understand, especially for athletes, you have time poor, breakfast time. If you're needing that cup of coffee or tea, usually that's going to be happening with your food. So just making sure that brekkie is like really, really loaded up on your vitamin C rich foods. So including some strawberries, some kiwi fruit, some papaya, some citrus, that kind of thing. That's going to go a long way to help kind of counteract the negative impacts.